and welcome to episode 70 of Prose. This week, let's take another foray into the world of Ash and Bone with Mynah, and see what happens when a Greek city does not pay tribute to a titan of destruction. I will forego my usual pleas for everyone to leave ratings, reviews, and to subscribe, and I will simply beg you all this. Share this show with one person. One person that likes podcasts, that enjoys fiction, that likes DIY projects, that is bored on their commute. One person that is a literature fiend. Just someone. Try to do so this week. That can go a very, very long way, and I can't tell you how much that would mean to me. Thanks for listening. Let's get to the tale, shall we? This week, we have Before the Fall and The Lovers Come to Town, a tale of Pérsis and Ăsterià. Enjoy! Before the Fall, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. How could she have ever been so naive? How could she, Mynah Dinjina Nasyandran, have ever believed that Rowan Penwarren, now being styled as Soter the Savior by his legions of followers, could have been good? Could have had humanity's best interests at heart. Even more problematic for her, Mynah couldn't help but wonder how she could have been so blind as to see friendship and maybe even love in his eyes at one time. Mynah had looked up from her whetstone, losing herself into an aimless stare and stopping the tedious but all-important work of sharpening her family blade. She craned her head back down and began sharpening again, consciously reminding herself that one can think and hone at the same time. The gods knew a dull blade would make for a quick grave. Reminiscing with idle hands was a dangerous pastime. All of that was a lifetime ago now, though. She had been young, of course. Rowan had, that first night anyway, been full of innocence and wonder to her eyes. He had been a boy trying to show his friend a trick. Albeit, he had been insistent that he show her that trick under the cover of darkness off in the heart of the woodlands. He'd even cursed the stars and moon that night for the paltry light they offered, damning their willingness to give him and her up to any prying eyes. In retrospect, as a good woman in firm standing in the village, as Mynah Dinjina din Arianda, as issue of Cyrus of Hele, Mynah should have turned and gone even then, long before the blood and death and sacrilege were a flicker in Rowan's eyes. She should have gone when her mother, the moon, was blasphemed and her children, the stars, slandered there in that still night. But her mother and sisters all shone down that night, proudly, and allowed Warren Pen Uther to seek and find the pair and to stop Rowan before he could harm anything or anyone else in his child's game turned torture. That night, it was just a rabbit whose life was leached from it for a small flame to ogle for the two children. In a matter of years, Rowan had gone on to butcher entire villages, to wrest and consolidate power. Soter the Savior? Rowan had first been dubbed Rowan, Butcher of the Beswain, and rightfully so. All those little bodies hacked to pieces and bobbing in the river. They had reminded her of simpler times. Apples bobbing in barrels for the harvest festival before the onset of true winter. Simpler times and simpler minds. She was not innocent, of course. Mynah had long since eschewed anything resembling morals, ethics, or innocence. She had not methodically disarticulated children for strengthening of magic or intimidating the peoples of the land, but she'd done plenty of killing, both with her own hands and by the thousands with her word. So much blood. Yet she didn't feel terribly sorry for it. Rowan and his zealots deserved some butchering themselves. Those fanatical acolytes and worshipping warriors followed the so-called Soter because, if she were being honest, he had been good to his word. The magics had all but disappeared from the lands after the forgetting, and, true to his promise, Rowan had reawakened forces long thought dead and most definitely made dormant. With that rekindling, Rowan had flipped the world's worship of the gods and their doling out of justice by way of damning magic to naught but death and pain and ash on its head. It was no surprise, then, that these bedraggled men and women that followed Rowan replaced the gods with this man who could bring down fire upon those that opposed them, this man who could keep them safe and feed them, this man who could end a man with a word and his will. Almost nightly, Mynah thought of touching what Rowan had so wholeheartedly embraced. She had the talent, after all. She could feel the currents of power in the world. From that first night when Warren Penuther had brought the hair leached of its life force for a few small flames, she had known that she could tap into those currents. Not as easily as Rowan. There really was a reason why he appeared a god to those that witnessed his power. But Mynah could feel the power rise up in the din of battle as men and women raged and killed and died. Those damned magics called to her, singing so sweetly of ending the battle all the more quickly, of safety, of making a difference, of saving lives by ending others. She did not dare become a conduit for that power, though. She had seen what it had done to Rowan and how quickly. He was far from insane, or at least she thought that that was the case, but he had quickly become something else, losing his love of humanity and his fellows, be they relatives, friends, or battle companions. Touching the tainted powers of the world hollowed a person out. Was this taking of the moral way, this avoiding of the primrose way, something that set her apart from or above Rowan? Of course not. She was not delusional. They were both tearing the world asunder, causing more pain than any two since, well, before the forgetting. He was a butcher. She was a terrorist. They were both the boogeyman of the other's force's nightmares. All those years ago in childhood, she had undoubtedly been too young, too simple, and ever so naive. But now, the world had made her hard. She more resembled the steels that her men carried as they marched day after day toward what she hoped would be the decisive battle of this damned apocalypse. After every battle, she hoped that the next would be the decisive battle. Mynah considered herself a realist, a pragmatist, but she never stopped hoping for this impossibility. She never stopped praying for it, leaning back on the lessons her lauded grandfather had taught her from across the ages, through stories and her parents' teachings, hopes, prayers. Despite all these changes, maybe Mynah was still too young, too simple, and sometimes, even now, a little bit naive. She realized she'd stopped her sharpening again. She blinked her eyes a few times to clear those heavy thoughts and set her mind on something lighter as she continued her task. Which companies would be on the dreaded front line tomorrow? That line was a death sentence. She continued to lithely run her blade against the stone, somewhat comforted by these lighter thoughts.
Thank you for listening to Before the Fall, a short story in an ever-growing world created by me, Jared I. McGee. If you would like a little bit more of the story, please hearken back to episode 61's Ash and Bone, where the world's introduced. Do note that a couple of characters' names have changed. Rowan Penwarren in this story was first named Jensen in episode 61, and Warren Penuther was first named Orrin Feinhold. Additionally, if you're enjoying this world, Be sure to tune in 2 weeks' time for the next short snippet exploring this world titled Charred, which will feature in Rowan Penwarren's point of view. All sounds you hear are coming from freesound.org, and they are being used in CC0 1.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication licenses. Next up this week, stick around to see what happens when you don't pay tribute to a titan in the time of the Greek gods. The Lovers Come to Town, a tale of Pérsi's and Ăsterià, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. The hustling and bustling on the streets of Anthopoulos was overwhelming, even to a lifelong resident. The streets were swollen and muddy with the increase in traffic, piss and wine and discarded water being left undrained, thereby creating a miasma that made navigating the crowd even more difficult. If a newcomer bumbled down the streets unaware of what was going on around them, they would quickly realize that something special was going on, and something not entirely positive or pleasant. That was why the city was humming with magic today. Bottles of elixirs against harm hung in stalls usually dedicated to wine and spirits. Expensive charms and baubles made of glass and ore and what passed as jewels glinted as they caught the light while swinging in the slight breeze coming in from the west. Supposedly, those pricey trinkets would keep a wearer invisible to both the attention of the Titans and any damage those immortals might decide to toss about. Animal sacrifices made the streets even gummier with blood flowing in torrents from the various makeshift altars and pop-up temples that dotted the dockside and ran every few yards all the way into the heart of the city. The scorched flesh sent plumes of sickeningly sweet and oddly musky smoke into the air, diminishing visibility and stinking up the entire city even beyond the stench that clung to the throngs. The city was bracing to pay for its sins. The moronic king had decided that staying on the good sides of the Titans was not worth the gold, incense, animal flesh, human flesh, and general cost that the city had been shouldering for as long as anyone could remember. Since times immemorial, the Titans had been paid their heavy tithe. Since times immemorial, even the most arrogant and impious at least kept Pérsi's happy. Everyone knew that, at the barest of the bare minimums, Pérsi's could not be ignored, at least not for long. The king had failed to bring forth his tithes to the mouth of the agreed-upon cavern system that was half aquatic and half forested, the caves dotting the coastline and kissed by the Aegean. Now the Titan of sheer destruction was coming to visit Anthopoulos and take his tribute for himself. In most circumstances, this meant rape, pillage, and razing to the ground for a city. However, this time might be different, or so the soothsayers cooed and the bards crooned. For some reason beyond a mortal's understanding, the mighty Titan was bringing his wife with him, Ăsterià, the beautiful and beloved by all the Titans and those upstart gods the people had begun to hear about of late. Supposedly, Ăsterià had a calming effect on Pérsi's. But, be that as it may, Anthopoulos could not sit back and relax. Not yet, even with her coming along for the confrontation. Ăsterià, the starry-eyed one, she with the diamond cloak and fiery girdle. She of ill omens, she of all magics, she of the quaint quail, life-giver to many on this island and in this city. Ăsterià might be a moderating force for Pérsi's taste of chaotic intervention, but she herself was no kind-hearted fan of the mortals.
How often had a general looked up to see a star careening down from the heavens and been shattered, knowing he would lead his men to death that coming morning? How many women had sought to become one of her nocturnes, seeking sight beyond eyes and knowledge beyond knowing, only to be turned away to the ravages of the hard land alone in the darkness? How often had she unleashed her fell daughter on the world, allowing her sway over the oracles and over the powers that tie humanity's reality together? No, the Titaness was no friend of humanity, but she was also no Perses. He was a Titan that thought no more of humanity than beyond just how utterly breakable they were, and how best to exploit their labors. What else might one expect from a son of Eurybia, of the flint heart, the expanse, the darkness? She had no love of mankind, so she couldn't very well engender any affectations of affection in her son. The hope of the city was palpable, even in the face of this uncertainty and probable annihilation. Maybe it was those damned upstart gods the newer priests were ranting about near the Acropolis. Upon a closer inspection, a great many of the stalls that were churning out prayers and corpses were not aimed at placating Perses. Rather, other stranger names were reverberating along amid the general din in the streets. Hades, Demeter, Hera, Poseidon, Hestia, Zeus, Zeus, Zeus. The Olympians, they were called. Many of the citizens were crying out in the direction of the growing power of Olympus then, begging that these youngling beings save Amphipolis from Perses and his mercurial, unpredictable bride. Change was in the air. That much was apparent. The ocean lapped at the docks, hypnotically and rhythmically as always. At first. Then, the swells began to grow and bulge. The strikes from the sea began to become more violent. The sky blackened while taking on a red hue. Every man, woman, and child looked up from what they were doing as a booming voice far deeper and far more powerful than imagining rang out across the city.
Prepare for sorrow and pain, Amphipolis. Your reckoning is upon you.
Perses was too big for one person to behold. They only caught snatches of his blackened, crackled flesh. Ăshteria burned the eyes, as if one goes from utter blackness and stares directly into torchlight of the sun. The people quailed and shook and ran and screamed. But those ranting droves, they turned in the direction of Olympus and prayed pitiful prayers. Thank you for listening to The Lovers Come to Town, A Tale of Perses and Ăshteria, a short story by me, Jared I. McGee. All music you hear comes from freepd.com and is being used under CC 0 Universal Public Domain Dedication licenses. I certainly love a good cliffhanger, don't you? Alright, well, that does it for Prose this week. Again, please do share the podcast with a friend this week and every week if you could. As always, I hope that you'll remember to love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is. Always stranger than fiction. See you next time, and thank you for listening.